your ear?
No, I just need to have full sensory awareness.
Oh yeah. So this is a very funny thing about me. So, and this is completely like something that happened because I was a reporter. When I go into a restaurant, I will not sit anywhere where I can't see the exits.
That's old mafia stuff.
Oh yeah. It's actually like, it's really sort of like, I picked it up from the foreign correspondents who did it. And I wasn't a foreign correspondent, but being a police reporter and covering all the crazy things that happen, you're just like, let me make sure I can find a quick dash.
Yeah, especially if you have like a sort of memory where you can record things and recall them later on. You want to see everything and then match it up as facts or tidbits.
Yes,
show
absolutely.
themselves.
You're kind of recording it in a way.
Yep.
So, let's see. Anyway, I am so sorry about canceling on you last time. Because
no, it's all right. Are you feeling better? I hope you're feeling better.
Much better. I
had a lot going on too. So
yeah, I saw your post like the same day, and I was like, thank the Lord we canceled it. I was like, we both would have been like,
yeah, that kidney stone, yeah, that hurt.
No, the COVID symptoms passed. It's hard to say relatively quickly because on Wednesday, Thursday, and much of the beginning of Friday, I felt like the world was moving in slow motion.
Yeah,
it was terrible. But so I was thinking I'd have the longer, that it would go on longer, but by Saturday, what happened by Saturday? By Saturday, the symptoms started to dissipate, but then I lost my smell. It was very funny. So I was, what was I doing? I don't know. I was like cooking or something like that. And I remember smelling something. Oh, no. I put a candle on. And I remember the smell was so strong, I couldn't take it. And then I went into the kitchen, right? And all of a sudden I was like burning incense. And I was like, I don't smell that at all. And so all day I'm like sticking my head in everything I can find, coffee, whatever.
Yeah.
To try and get a sense of smell. What worked was sage. I burnt sage and I smelled. So here's to possibly getting my voice. I mean, getting my smell back. So I'll go ahead and get us started. And then, we can dive into questions and we can take whatever questions listeners have as well. So
just be wary of trolls.
I'm all for trolls. So
I see what I'm up against.
Right. I know. Seriously, man. I don't know how you do it. Well, I know how I do it. I ignore them.
That's what I've found to be successful.
It is the best thing because, well, they lose their oxygen at that point, right? Like if I respond to trolls or if I even make fun of trolls, all that does is like, especially when I'm like making fun of them, it sends the message to them that it bothers me.
Yeah, exactly. And it gives them a forum to re-engage. And, everybody that had wanted to stand up, I was like, sit down.
Yeah.
Don't give them your platforms. Don't give them the space.
Don't lead people to them.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. You want to fight back, but let the silence do the heavy lifting.
Yep, I agree. There's a beauty to tranquility, I think. So, all right, I'll go ahead and go.
Yep.
So that's Raul Montero, a researcher, advocate, and journalist who's known online as Catch LISK. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Raul Montero grew up in the New York. Oh, whoa, let's do that. Because I just edited it. Raul Montero grew up in the New York metropolitan area, spent many years privately researching the Long Island serial killer case after 4 victims were found on Gilgo Beach in 2010. Now, at least 11 or more, depending on how you count it, victims have been identified in the killings, and Rex Heuermann, a Long Island architect, has been arrested as a suspect in the case. Raul eventually searched for ethical, transparent, and accurate advocates and researchers online who are looking into the case, and he's built a community that's dedicated to identifying missing or murdered, marginalized victims, some of whom are connected to the Long Island serial killer case, and some who may not be. Raul has also developed deep relationships with some of the loved ones of the victims. Over time, he became frustrated with many of the inaccuracies that have become common beliefs about the case, and he's dedicated himself to setting the record straight. Rao told our researcher, Jessica Cash, that he's always tried to keep, quote, the victims and families on a pedestal and protected and defend them when they were unable to comment. Rao maintains a LISK missing, murdered, and unidentified cold case map and a timeline of the Long Island serial killer case, Rex Heuermann's life and the victims' lives. He's also created resources that he said were designed to make collection of information easier. He also supports law enforcement by passing on relevant information. Today, we're going to discuss the LISK. Today, we're going to discuss the LISK case, how murders and other criminals prey on the most vulnerable, and how we can do more for the marginalized, who often, despite being deeply loved, are at the highest likelihood of being taken from us and their loved ones. So, Raul, I just wanted to thank you for joining. I am so excited to have this conversation. Long before we actually ever had a conversation, I have been following your work. I was interested in the case. Um, was fascinating to me for many of the reasons that I think you were drawn to it. These very marginalized victims, or these victims on what some people call the edge of society, but really in reality, they're very much a part of society, and how so many of them could end up on that beach. So I guess I was just following you in the background, and it was a pleasure to get the introduction and meet you through a number of other people who are in this true crime space. And I just wanted to, as I dug in and found out more and more about what you did, and I know the work as somebody who's a reporter by background that goes into doing that, I just wanted to express my appreciation for all that and for you being here.
I appreciate that. That gets me, I mean, it gets me emotional all the time because I still, and I'll say it often, I'm a nobody, just a curious person. And I like structure. I believe in the truth. I believe in um, empathy because it's something I've struggled with my entire life. I can't watch The Little Mermaid with my daughter without crying. I get emotional, and it's become sort of the family joke that, oh my god, if even if it's a cartoon on, I'm gonna get emotional about it. But you learn in my life, in my work life, through different iterations of careers, people are just beautiful. Like, they're people are special, and as a human being, they should just be respected. And regardless of their socioeconomic situation, regardless of their religious preference, or their their skin color, or whatever, at the end of the day, there's no difference between you and I, me and any other random person. We bleed the same, and we all cry the same tears. So extending empathy for me was challenging because no one could understand it. And it wasn't until I've gone through several different layers of this true crime space, before I found like-minded people. And I was surprised by that. I was actually taken aback by that, and I was suspicious of it
You're
because,
like, do these people really exist?
yeah, to put myself out there means I'm exposed to
Mm.
being laughed at. And it's one thing to have your wife or your kids laugh at you for getting emotional over something silly. Like, I'm guaranteed to cry on a Super Bowl commercial. Like, I'm moved easily by that. So
I don't think a good cry is all that bad anyway. I mean, I know you know, for a long time, men, you know, have not been expected to cry. And as a guy who probably cries in every other podcast that he has, and I mean like genuine tears of pain, not superficial.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's a power in it for me. There's a power in it for other people too, because I think when people can be vulnerable in front of an audience, I think it makes it easier for other people to be vulnerable. And I think it really opens up. It's the same thing with admitting mistakes. I think it really opens up the door to allow other people to be vulnerable and other people to admit their mistakes, and people can see the strength in that. So I'm not sure if I consider that a negative quality.
Yeah, I don't it isn't a negative quality. I've learned to accept it. I mean, I've accepted it my entire life because even if I'm gosh, I remember watching some Meerkat Manor on Discovery Channel and literally falling to pieces when the main meerkat died from a snake bite while protecting her family. And everybody in the house thought it was funny, and I am emotionally wrecked by
So you
it.
really can't do Disney movies where the like some key character
It's
dies and
really hard.
yeah.
It gets really hard sometimes. Like, I know, and even with Super Bowl, there's a lot of emotionally charged
Mhm.
commercials. That's how the metric works. But I
Well,
think for me, I mean, I was raised by a single mom, me and my brother. We were on welfare. We lived in the projects. It wasn't until my mother remarried that, I was provided an opportunity for a better education and a sort of middle class upbringing. And, but I've never forgotten that, to stay humble. And whenever I find myself being even a little bit arrogant, I got a few people that'll call me up or text me and put me in check. And to that, I appreciate that, because you never want to get too full of yourself. You never want to forget um,
who you
who
are and
you
where you
are as a
came from.
core person. And then I never want to, when it comes to researching the list case or any other case that I work with, you never want to be so full of yourself that you're creating a narrative
Well,
regardless of what other people think. I remain incredibly objective and open-minded.
yeah, because it's really their narrative. It's not like, and I think of this as hard as a journalist because people need narrative to understand things, but you have to remind yourself it's not the narrative that you want. It's interesting you say talking about like being that sort of sensitive to those kinds of things. Like part of me understands why you would gravitate towards something like this because you have a tremendous amount of empathy. The other part of me is like you have a tremendous amount of empathy, which really probably makes you vulnerable in a way that it wouldn't for someone like me, in the sense that I do have a tremendous amount of empathy, but when I get into certain situations where I have to turn it off, or I have to turn it off, like, reporting, I need to like turn it off and turn it on a little bit at
Mhm.
different times. Um, but it's just interesting to me that you would gravitate towards such a sad and emotionally charged case. How did you first get interested in it? Was it more of a private thing at first, or did you tell me about that?
I I'm asked this question often, and I think about it more than I'm asked, because I don't think that any answer I've given to date can ever really articulate it properly. I mean, I had I had child abuse in my life, and I'm 56 years old, turning 57, and I still struggle with some of that. I accept it. It's helped make me as strong as I am, but I'm a Libra, like a pure Libra, so I can fluctuate from complete puddle on the floor to, fighting in the street. So it's hard. I think my interest really began in the psychopathy of evil people
Mm,
because of the abuse that was inflicted on me, and I wanted to understand what motivated this person to do that to me. I was a kid and my brother, and I'm sharing a lot. And it all emanated from that. So I wanted to understand triggering mechanisms for like Ted Bundy, or like I think that was the first one I really looked into. And it just evolved into that. I think I was absolutely moved beyond measure by reading at like 10 or 11 years old the book Sybil, and wondering how a victim of child abuse can shatter into multiple
A
personalities.
million pieces. You know, it's interesting you say that because I think that's part of my motivation for my interest in psychology is I experienced child abuse as a child. Mm. I think it probably affected me differently than you, and it's probably a personality thing because, you know, it's not something that in itself I've absolutely forgiven the person and honestly moved on from that. But what you can see is it had ripple effects and it made everything else in life harder and more difficult. And I always felt that same feeling of wanting to understand perpetrators. And I'm not to excuse, although I have a tendency to excuse bad behavior, but not to necessarily excuse behavior, but to just understand, like you said, human life is precious and beautiful, how such horrible things can come from something that is so precious and beautiful.
Yeah.
So I find what you're saying very relatable.
Yeah. And I think as I really just like looked into just the madness of evil people, and at the crux of a lot of it was some profound point in their upbringing where they suffered tremendous abuse of several different types, and in some cases every single type. And I'm grateful, like my
Well, and I
what
think
I
there's
went through wasn't as bad as at all of some of these other people, but for me, my interest became what was the catalyst to make them like I won't even step on an ant. I'll move my step around to not step on an ant on the floor. Yet I am really curious how someone can go so far to the extreme opposite.
well, you know, one of the motives for me is not just like understanding perpetrators for me, but also I heard this line recently. Someone, I can't remember where I heard it. Um, but someone said like the way that you learn to, it may have been one of my guests, but the way you learn the way a clock should work is by studying a broken clock. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think there was a part of me who also wanted to make sure that my experience was not going to lead me to become some horrible person or
Yeah.
perpetrator. So it's very complicated, I think.
It is. I mean, I knew I could never be evil against somebody. I'm not a perfect human being. I'm not trying to. There's no
Mhm.
halo above me. I have my own faults, but to bring violence to someone else is, to me, it's a universe of space. I don't understand it, and while I can relate, even sympathize with some of these evil people and what they, let me carefully say that. I can sympathize with the abuse that they went through. I can't, and I still don't understand how the path forward for them lies on a road that removes other people's lives from this planet. That for me was the curious element. And I think as I when I became more and more, and I still don't find the right adjective for this. Interested or whatever with the mystery of the Long Island serial killer. Um, I began to not focus so much on who this killer was, but I became more focused on learning who these victims were.
Perfect.
And that was
Yeah.
a profound change for me because I know I can be drawn to someone, to anyone, for a million different reasons. And all of the victims along Ocean Parkway, the Gilgo victims, had such beautiful elements around their lives.
Do you
And
want,
I learned
do you want to
quickly
talk?
that, go ahead,
Do you
I'm
want
sorry.
to talk? I was going to say, do you want to talk a little bit about those victims? Because I'm not sure everyone. I'm familiar with their stories to some extent because of my own research, but I'm not sure that everyone is.
Yeah, most people aren't. If they are, they know the words Shannon Gilbert, um, who I consider just an angelic catalyst, an unwitting sacrifice that ultimately led to the discovery of Lisk, of Rex Hewerman. I think Shannon means so much to me personally. She should mean so much to the world because, and not to take anything away from anyone, Shannon, just surrounding the mystery of her disappearance, the 19 months of not knowing where she was, and then ultimately finding her remains, but during that time uncovered almost all of the other remains. So Shannon goes missing, and it doesn't get any real airplay. I caught it somehow. I was living on Long Island at the time. I was working in Long Island at the time, and I remember hearing about Shannon, and it really wasn't until the first victim was found on Ocean Parkway. That was Melissa Barthelemy. Once Melissa was found, then Maureen was found, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, then Megan Waterman, then Amberlynn Costello, and then suddenly, for me, worlds collided where there's 4 bodies found along the beach, a beach that I used to go to as a kid, with multiple similarities between them, and the instant two phrase word serial killer becomes, paramount in that. So while I
And
was
so,
instantly drawn to being curious about a serial killer, I was instantly balanced out by Shannon, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber. And then we found,
really, Shannon, the law enforcement currently believes is not a part of the Long Island serial killer case. It may have been an accident or something. Is that right? Or something along those
yeah,
lines. Or
they just, it's undetermined. It They say it's just an unfortunate accident. I can share that there's no evidence of murder, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So,
oh,
you know,
absolutely.
we
Yeah.
just don't know yet. And although her civil case, the trial against Peter Hackett, goes to court August 6th for another hearing, we don't know the outcome of that yet. And any type of justice for Shannon um, will help to some degree, relatively, for the Gilbert family to move on in some manner. But Shannon will always be the catalyst of this case. I'm not going to say that without Shannon we may never have found any of the other victims. Who you can't say that yes or no, but it is because of Shannon that we found Melissa, Maureen, Amber, um, Megan, Jessica, Valerie, parts of Peaches, Asian Doe, and Toddler. So Shannon predicated the Long Island serial killer case. It is because of Shannon's unwitting sacrifice. And it should not be, she may not be a list victim, but she is the
But
case.
her role shouldn't be minimized because to
Right.
some extent, you know,
And that's
she
what bothers me when I even stand up for Shannon. People go, well, she's not a list victim, so we're not going to talk about her. Well, you shouldn't just relegate her to the back room. Like, she doesn't deserve that. You wouldn't have a forum to talk about if it wasn't for Shannon. And I think she may not be a list victim, but she deserves to be part of the conversation.
well, she began, regardless of whether she's a list victim, she began the process of solving the case. That's at the end of the day, she really did. Um, I remember the experience of getting the call. I was in Hilton Head on vacation with my brother. Lisk was the last thing I was thinking about, but I got a call from a New York reporter who, from the good old days when I was reporting in New York, when it was the morning after Rex Heuermann was arrested, and I was sitting at the airport, this tiny little airport in Hilton Head, where like you could throw a rock across the whole parking lot. And soon after, I got the charging documents on my phone. I reached out to like 3 creators in true crime who are my friends, and well, 2 out of 3 didn't believe me. The the third was like, "I know your info is good." So I'm after I let them know about it, got the documents to them, I started looking up Rex Heuermann's family, and I found Victoria Heuermann's resume, portfolio, and phone number online. And that really sort of like struck me as somebody who's been involved in a scandal and knows what's about to happen. Like instantly, in an hour or two, this is going to get announced and everyone's going to have her information. So I was sitting at the airport and I got out my phone and I sent a text to her number and said, "You should take this all down now. You should take it down." And I thought that was like an interesting reaction for me to immediately think of something like that. And you know, I I thought the case would never be solved because of the way that the police had handled it, and 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 because of the backgrounds of the victims. I really thought it would never be solved because the effort that I had seen so far um, didn't really impress me. The way the FBI was treated, I had heard a little bit about and their interactions, and it didn't really impress me. What was your reaction when you heard?
So I was actually in a laundromat doing laundry, and I had just put the wet clothes in the dryer. This is so embarrassing. And it was about 5:40 a.m. because I'm an early bird. And I got a text message.
Your sources are better than mine. It took another hour for me.
I got a text message that this was about to break and a suspect was in custody. And I freaked out. I started messaging a couple of people that I'm close with, and um, the scramble began. Like, I had 15 minutes before the news was going to break publicly, and I'm stuck in a goddamn laundromat waiting on wet clothes to dry. And I'm like, my laptop is at home. I cannot do this here. It's too hot. I'm already freaking out. Damn the wet clothes to hell. I threw them all in the bag and I ran back to the house. And I was, within 8 minutes, I was at where I'm sitting now on my laptop. And emotionally,
Did
I
you ever think it would be solved? Did you think it would be solved?
no, I always felt like it could be solved. I wanted to believe Rodney Harrison with all my heart when he came in saying it was going to be a priority, but he came in and it was silence. And I was much more ignorant then than I am now. And I was also much more full of piss and vinegar. So, my tweets, when Suffolk County Police Department would tweet how they stopped traffic on the Southern State Parkway so some ducklings can cross. And I'm like, how about solving some fucking serial murders, for Christ's sake, and I would put that out there on Instagram, on Twitter. Like I was relentless with that. But I think the news of that day rocked me because everything that I was looking into and researching and have become committed to, and the relationships and friendships that I built over many years, suddenly we were at the precipice of something incredibly monumental. And I went through a million emotions. I went through euphoria. I had a complete meltdown on my sofa. I was hysterical. I called people and hung up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Like, I'm like, they don't need to know this right now. But I think after the first 10 minutes of it, and just the shock of it all, I just went and I thought of each of the victims, and then I thought of each of their family members, and then I lost it even more, probably really hard, because having gotten to know so many of them, um, I felt for them. I felt for them really deeply.
I remember, I think it was when I was reading the book Lost Girls. That's the first time. It's really interesting. For all the news coverage that I read about it, I think Lost Girls was the first time, the book, where I got any sense of their backstories, any sense of what their families were like. And I mean, as a reporter, it wasn't ridiculously surprising, but I think for a lot of people, it's really surprising what kind of families they came from and how some of those families were so similar
Yeah.
to just anyone's. And I remember this time where I was reading Lost Girls and I was in Virginia, and I was at the house I shared with my partner at the time. And she was in Long Island visiting her family members. And I was reading through that whole book and I was getting to the end of the book. And I remember saying afterwards, perhaps you should not read a book about a serial killer where your partner is traveling. And, I am not want for that kind of panic because I know the odds, but like I picked up the phone. I was like, are you okay? Blah, 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 blah. She was like, calm down. And I just remember in that moment, through reading the book, and this is long before any of it was solved, feeling so deeply for the families and the impact that it had on the community. At the same time, sort of political leaders and others were not moving. What was it like for the families waiting?
Well, it's hard. It's hard. I can only express my opinion on what they went through because I didn't go through that. If you go even, I won't go back as far as Sandra Castilla's family because I haven't spoken with them and I don't know them.
And Sandra's the victim that they recently
Yes,
identified
from
from
1993.
Okay. And that's
But
more of a recent one, yeah.
yeah, and you go back to 2003 with Jessica Taylor, her family there, absolutely shattered. To this day, absolutely shattered. They can't speak. They can't be in front of a camera.
Another unknown thing about them too that I'm sure you're familiar with, because I've had some conversations with her cousin and a couple other people in their family just by happenstance. Um, you know, not only were these people sort of like left to wonder, not having much law enforcement interaction, according to them, they were even scammed by people once the case happened. There were people who took advantage of them, people who shouldn't have, like lawyers and other people like that. And that really took me aback.
Yeah, I mean, it never ends. There's always some sort of institutionalized grifting that capitalize on it. That's why, just to flash forward to where my advocacy is now, when I see somebody with a missing person and they're like, call my cell, I'm like, the first thing you want to do is not call your cell. Don't give your cell out, because you will have people even saying, like, we have her, and send us $5,000 and we'll release her. Like, people are that despicable,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's horrible, to prey on people's most vulnerable moment when they're looking for their loved one, to try to make money, is just reprehensible to me. Like, that, there's no God for people like that, and I think it's terrible. um Lost Girls was an incredible book that was purely victim centric. But even prior to that, Timothy Bolger from the Long Island Press was the first one to put out there an article, called Lost Girls, about missing Megan Waterman from Rhode Island, from Maine, rather, forgive me. And, started to humanize sex workers and the plight. And I think we while Lost Girls certainly was victim centric and gave us an incredible bibliography, if you will, of information, um, it then all falls off the radar for a number of years. And during that missing period of time, narratives were created, um, really just victim shaming, victim blaming families, and it really became just something so disgusting to me. Like, there were truths and there were lies, and the lies had the floor. And for me, it was a problem. And that's when I started collecting. Well, here's the rumor. Well, here's an opposite rumor, and here's a secondary opposite, and I started to want to flesh out what was the truths. and,
Well,
and
one of the interesting things about this case, just putting myself in the shoes of the victim's family members, and then sort of like myself at the same time. I think as this case has progressed and we've learned more and more details about what happened, it has not been easier. A lot of times people think knowing the answer will help them. The more that I find out, like the most recent revelations about the likelihood of torture and the likelihood that they were held for days, the more pain I feel. Not to say that like there is an importance to the truth, but I think the path to healing can be really long.
the path for healing is right now an endless road. It's a bottomless pit. There isn't a foreseeable future. You can jump ahead to a conviction and then a path forward. But the distance between present day now and a conviction is a world of torment that these families are going to have to experience. If this goes to trial, what we learned in the most recent superseding bail document is probably nothing in comparison that what will be revealed in trial. And it's hard. This superseding bail document was devastating to read. You don't even have to have compassion or empathy and not go, my God, what is this? And how can a human do this, plan this, prepare for this, and sort of assess their success in this? It really is depraved. And what may come out in court in a trial is exponentially more shattering,
Yeah.
and it's
I mean,
hard
we
to
don't
say
even
what
know
goes
the
on.
results of the autopsies yet and the
Yeah, and
wounds
and
or
there's so much more evidence that they have. Like the superseding bail document is descriptive in a limited way. One, because the prosecution isn't irresponsible, and two, it's not necessarily ready for any public consumption. I don't know if I'm ready for this, and I've seen autopsy photos, I've seen case files on horrible things, and they don't sit well with me. I can't imagine them sitting well with somebody with even a little bit less empathy than I have. And to know, that there are certainly, photos and crime scene photos is just something me personally, I don't want to experience.
Right.
Me as having relationships with some of the family members, I don't want them to go through that. It's
And I
horrible.
imagine some will choose not to. Some will choose to. And I think the important part in there is figuring out your own path to healing and having people who advise you on that there's no one way to do it, whatever's going to bring you peace. I wanted to ask you, there are a couple things in the case and about the victims. And I wanted to ask you whether you believe that the Long Island serial killer, because I know Sherman is not, you know, it's not fully adjudicated yet, but the Long Island serial, do you believe that they targeted certain types of victims beyond factors like their simple factors like their appearance and height and things like that? Do you think, you know, does it appear that the person was targeting people who were on the margins because they would get less attention, because
I
there would
think,
be less
yeah, I think historically, if you look at people struggling with drug addiction, um, people doing survival work, people on the perceived fringes of society, people that don't have anybody looking out for them as a perception looking out at them, um, they're more vulnerable, and they are. To say that they're not is to be disingenuous. They are more vulnerable. They are in more riskier environments or occupations, whether it's a willingness to participate or a necessity to participate in some of these things. Um, Plus, it opens up to a spectrum of personalities that have overwhelming desires, whether they're sexually driven or to induce physical pain driven or emotionally manipulating driven. And in rare cases like serial killers, it's all of them in one. So marginalized people are the easiest of targets because they go missing. They're probably not in the same location that they live. Their family is scattered about or far away from where they are or were last seen. Um, and the perception is that they're not thought of or cared for. That was the narrative surrounding Jessica Taylor, that her family didn't care and all of this nonsense, when it was so far from reality that it's insulting.
Well, I think in my mind, just putting my reporter hat on, I think there's a slightly different equation if I'm sort of like the killer. And it's not so much that their family doesn't care about them, but the family is not going to have the juice to get the attention,
Mhm.
to get, or the political influence, or more importantly, that when people hear the word sex worker, I know you mentioned sex worker or survival worker because there are people who are doing it for their survival, and there are people who do it because they enjoy it.
Mhm.
And when they hear the word sex worker, it breaks the narrative. And I even in a case like Breonna Maitland, where you have middle class girl in Vermont. The moment someone suggested, which we don't really even have much evidence for, that she was involved in drug use, the attention just went.
Absolutely. And
And,
and that's a systemic problem. It's a generational problem. It is embedded in our collective mindset as Americans. It is what it is. It's terrible. I think with the Long Island serial killer, I think Lisk is an absolutely sexually driven deviant, whereas it's more than just the need to have sex. That in and of itself can be innocuous as long as it's consensual and nonviolent. I think when it came to Lisk, it encompassed so much more. And I think with him, his preferences were varied and they changed, almost like sampling something new. As disgusting as that sounds, it feels even more disgusting to say it. Which is why you have a spectrum of classifications on Ocean Parkway. You have Peaches, who's African American. You have Asian Doe. We don't know how they identified themselves, but they were found in women's clothing. So they could be gay, they could be trans, or preparing for trans. You have the other five that are 5'2", 110 pounds. For me, I keyed into the hazel eyes. On my map, I make, even to this day, it could have probably, most likely, may not have anything to do with Lisk, but hazel eyes is a thing for me, and I'll make a hazel green icon for it. I think the hazel eyes means something to him. I still believe that. He has hazel eyes. His daughter has hazel eyes. So I think there's a catalyst to that. But then there's a wide variety of possible. Sugar Bear, who's 6'5", African American, a drag artist, and I think Lisk was trying everything he can because he was enabled to continue to get away with it. He wasn't being caught. There was no heat on him until 2020.
well, I also think that there's a misconception about serial killers that people have. And I think one of the misconceptions people have is that they have the same type. And I think some of that misconception comes from like a self-defensive thing that we have where we want to say we're not the type of fill in the blank. But the reality is, like, you find a lot of variety. Israel Keys is an example. Even Ted Bundy, even though he had
a type.
predominant type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bundy was very opportunistic, and
Yep.
that's the other thing.
And I think too, it's just like every other human being on the planet. Like, we have varying degrees for variety, and there are things that we like, and that's not just a sexual thing. But I think the thing that's hard for people is that, oh, these people are like a lot more like us than we think they are.
Well, I think our biggest mistake as a rational society is to believe that serial killers exist within our square box of rationality. They do not. That's why anyone who sits there and says MOs don't change, I can't engage with, because I can prove it out of just 10 serial killers off the top of my head.
Well,
Then they say signatures don't change. Well, signatures do change. They can change as often as an MO, and signatures are the stuff of Hollywood. You very rare do you get a signature in a serial killer.
Yeah, and just defining the difference. An MO is your modus operandi. It's the things that you do to get away with the crime.
Yep.
The signature may be a unique thing that you do that is not necessary to commit the crime, right? And it's more of a ritual for you. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, that MO is stable. It's not. It's based on efficiency. It's based on, circumstance. Where are people? Where am I? What's going on in the news these days, what technology exists out there. So inevitably MO is going to change. And
if you're smart, you change your MO.
Yeah, and signature over time is going to develop. And we certainly see in this case that, there are clearly some victims who are dismembered. I'm sure that served a purpose. There were clearly some victims who were not dismembered. But I think, one of the things people had a difficult time with in the beginning, and I know some folks in the FBI who worked on the case in the second phase of the FBI being there, but one of the things that one person from the FBI told me was that some people in law enforcement had a hard time wrapping their head around, they could connect the Gigolo four, because they were, found near each other. They were in burlap sacks. They were strangled. Um, the dismemberments, may have been in multiple locations, didn't have burlap sack, there wasn't always a sack. And they were saying some of the law enforcement were having a hard time wrapping their head around the possibility that it could be the same killer. But killers, like the rest of us, change our behavior. I change my commute because traffic is different. All these different things.
Yeah.
Today I want vanilla ice cream. Tomorrow I want strawberry. And so I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around those.
Well,
But
I think
there are commonalities between the victims he chose, right?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you look at just the Gilgo Four, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, anywhere from 4'11" to 5'2", 5'3", 110 on average, but they all had hazel, bluish green eyes. And then you look at, and they were just intact. And then you look at,
all were in the sex trade too.
yeah.
Right.
Then you look at Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, who were dismembered, but they also had the same physical characteristics, especially the eyes. And then you start to go, people would say, well, it's dismemberment versus disposal intact, and it's two serial killers. Well, no. And I don't mind having, an intellectual, nuanced conversation about it, but MO changes, signatures. If there's only a handful of experts on Richard Cottingham, and even those experts can tell you there is no signature.
Who is he? Cottingham?
Richard Cottingham is the Times Square torso killer who has pretty much admitted to about 100 murders, although he's not been convicted of that many. He's 17. No, that's Rifkin. Less than that, but Cottingham changed his MO all the time. Cottingham was opportunistic. Cottingham will drive through, a town in New Jersey and chat up a housewife and kill her. He was incredibly opportunistic, but he was also viciously violent. But there's still no signature for Cottingham. He's strangled, he's stabbed, he blunt force trauma, he beheaded, he set fire. It's
probably more of a factor of, not just getting away, but also, personality, right?
Yeah, it's personality, it's time and circumstance. Cottingham was in the 70s, well, according to him, late 60s, 70s, and 80s. He went to jail in 1980. Rifkin had a particular type, an MO for the most part, and a sloppy, disorganized killer. Richard Schulman had a particular type. He would pick up sex workers Schulman lived in Long Beach, Long Island. He was a postal worker in New York City. He picked up sex workers in Yonkers and would discard them. And then you have Lisk, who outlived them all. Had in my opinion, had an awareness of everyone that came before him, and I validate or justify that by saying the only letter he ever responded to in jail was to the smiley face killer, a happy face killer, Keith Jesperson. So he had an awareness of his peers. And that this is certainly my opinion.
So you're saying that is the only person Hurman responded to?
Yep.
Was the happy face killer?
Yep.
Wow.
I mean, he may have responded to his family and stuff that I don't know, but
I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, that letter came out, and I had it validated, of course, by the podcaster who put it out there. And it's legit. It's been validated. It's out there as public knowledge.
What did
And
he say?
well, this is where my hashtag no butter for Rex came from, because Rex was complaining about not having butter for his bread in jail. Poor thing.
Sort of the least of my worries at that point.
Exactly. And I found it all just, confounding, because if you're saying you're innocent, I guess you can complain about no butter in jail, but the only person you reply to is a serial killer. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a
It,
conundrum for
right.
me. But that just to me shows how self-aware he was of himself. And that's also validated in the most recent superseding bail document, because he had an awareness. He had an awareness of what
Yeah,
he's done in the past.
John Douglas's book, The
Yeah.
Cases That Haunt
And he
Us.
also had an awareness of missed opportunities, or not as perfect um
Victim.
executions of his
Yeah, or
plan.
execution. Yeah. I mean, he talked about next time I should do X or Y.
Yeah.
I'm curious, having the relationship with the victims' families, studying the case, looking into other cases. There are two things I wanted to ask you. How far do you think these go back? And if you're comfortable speculating, how high do you think really three things, the number could be? And what do you think we can do because I have a feeling it's going to be a shocking number. What do you think we can do to better protect marginalized victims?
So I'll say the last question for last, because that's the powerhouse question. I think I personally believe he escalated to murdering human beings in the early 80s, which puts him, it could put him as young as 18 years old. It's earlier than the FBI standard of 25. Um, but Sandra Castilla in 93 puts him at 23 years old, 65, 75, 85, 95, yeah, about 27 years old, 28 years old, which is right there in the prime spectrum of, according to the FBI, of when serial killers escalate to human murder. I believe that there's more than that. I believe Judith Ramona Velaz, who was 5'2", hazel eyes, strawberry blonde hair, also in 93, last seen on 10th Avenue, 11th Avenue, 30th Street, um, a mile away, barely from his office in 93. I believe she's a Liz victim. And as far as a count, I think for me, I think a modest account is 60 plus.
Modest.
Modest.
Modest would be 60 plus.
I personally put him at about 100 plus. I think there's enough to go through. And I've documented it all on like my possibles list and my Rex timeline database. And they're all there. And there are reasons why I believe, and certainly many of them can be crossed out or overlap with, domestic violence or happenstance, which is such a cruel way to say it. But I think there's something there. Wherever someone is on my possibles list, there's a location for Rex Heuermann, not far away.
That's frightening.
And that is what's frightening. That's what keeps me up at night often. And as far as what can be done, I think that's such a bigger question that deserves a whole lot more time to really discuss with not only myself, but many other people that are even more nuanced than I am. But I think the first thing we need to do is remove stigmas. Like, remove all the stigmas. Stop dehumanizing people for their race, their religion, their occupation, their social status. I think when it comes to sex workers, stop using the word prostitute and hooker. Like, it's crude. and because you're from a generation where that was the word, doesn't give you a
You
free
know what it
pass.
reminds me of? It reminds me of when my dad was in Vietnam. This drove him crazy. There were all sorts of phrases that the soldiers would use for Vietnamese.
Yeah.
I'm not going to repeat them right now, but
Yep.
they're a common part of dialect still, which is frightening.
Yeah.
But they would use them, and my dad said, "Well, the purpose was to dehumanize them, so it made it easier to kill them." And I feel like we dehumanize people, you know, um, like words for Black people, words for Native Americans, words for people who are in sex work. I'm sure people can think of many of those words, which I don't want to say, but it makes it easier to look away when
Exactly.
something bad is happening to them, whether it's they're not able to get housing, they don't have water, or they die.
Mhm. Well, that's why it's so important. And I've been, I get ridiculed on this every once in a while recently, in fact, say their names. That's why we say their names, because it's more than saying that any victim is a mother, a daughter, a niece, a sister, whatever. That victim is who they are. They are them too. We can sit there and say, Maureen is a mom, Maureen's a sister, Maureen is a daughter, Maureen's a sister-in-law, a niece, a cousin. But Maureen is Maureen.
She's
And
a human.
she
Yep.
Maureen belongs to Maureen and her family. Jessica belongs to Jessica and her family. Shannon belongs to Shannon and her family. As committed as I am to all of them, they don't
I would,
belong to me. They
I
hold a
would,
place in my heart, but
I would slightly dispute that because I would say that in the ideal world, they all belong to all of us because they are humans like us. But where I feel like that's not necessarily the case is when people dehumanize them or try to take advantage of them or
yes.
other things like that. But in the perfect world, they would all belong to us. That I would feel like you talked about before, crying at the movie, that I would feel that same sadness when I think of Valerie Mack or Jessica Taylor, because something, and I really believe this, and I think that's part of the reason why I talk about or have conversations with people in these cases. I feel like every time we lose a Jessica Taylor or we lose even Brianna or we lose a well-known case like Abby Williams and Libby Germain out in the Delphi murders, or we lose people, like Melissa Montoya. We had one of her friends, she was lost
Mhm.
in the Navajo
Mhm.
reservation, and for 23 years there wasn't an article written about it until this year. And we all lose something because humans are so unique, and we lose something so special when anyone leaves us because it cannot be created. There will never be another. Um, and So I agree with you. There's a special place for the families, but I think we should feel that sense of loss when someone is unfairly taken away.
I mean, I know I feel it. I'm often chastised by, critics for, you know, being too emotional, too drawn to any of them. And all I can say is so.
I think it's possible to love somebody you've never met.
Yeah, I care very much for all of them. I care very much for any of the missing people that I work with their families. I care an incredible amount for them. When Lisk was arrested was probably the last time I did a full grocery shopping, because I'm a little bit bougie and I like a full stock of nice things, and I haven't really
And
done
after my
that.
own heart.
Yeah, like I haven't done any of that since then. And I'm not crying martyrdom. I'm not. I have a little belly, so I'm clearly eating, but um, it changed everything. And
Can
I
I
don't
ask
want,
a question about that?
yeah,
Do you believe, and I know in the last 2 years they had an intense search and identified him. Do you believe that law enforcement treated these cases the same way they would have if these were people from middle class families? And part of the reason where my question is coming from is almost a deeper place than the cliche. Because I remember when I was in New York, Jonathan Levine, who is a teacher, um, was killed. We ultimately found out by one of his students. And I was in the police shack, which is on the second floor of NYPD headquarters, and it's where all the reporters were. And I remember getting the call from somebody in the deputy commissioner for public information's office who said, "We have a real red ball." And what he meant was this was going to be politically on fire and that they needed to solve this very, very quickly. Um, and you don't hear that about every case. There is a clear, when it comes to the police department, there is a clear ranking.
yeah,
And, I talk about this often, being out on a crime scene and a detective saying to me there were NI8, or was it NHI, which meant no humans involved. And like in that example, it was actually a sex worker who
yeah,
was transsexual and whoever their killer was, which they
yeah.
didn't. And
Look,
what
you look at the List case from the beginning. You had the generational ignorance. I'll really give it that nice of a stamp of Dormer and Verone, basically saying to the public,
Dormer, Dormer and
uh,
Verone.
Dormer was the police commissioner, and Dominic Verone was the lead investigator in the initial onset of the List case, where they said to the public, you don't have to worry. These were sex workers, basically. I'm paraphrasing. That the line of work that they were in is sort of the reason why they were murdered.
Does that mean like you don't have to worry? This is
Yeah,
not
your
going to
daughters are
happen to
safe as
your
long as they're
daughter?
right. Your daughters are safe if they're not sex workers, basically. And it can be a rubber stamp to a generational dialect, but it's still insensitive. And that has permeated the entire case ever since. Shannon was not only a sex worker, an escort, but she had bipolar. Like all these labels started being stamped upon these victims, and it just meant that your average daughter, white girl, blonde hair, blue eyes, is safe. Well, they're really not.
Yeah,
And
no, not by any stretch of the imagination. Because if you listen to the stories of some of these girls, they are your average daughter
yeah,
who ended up in.
that's why I think like your episode with um Nicole Petito
Mhm.
was so profound because both Nicole and Joe, through their foundation, really devote time, attention, empathy, love, care, and money to bringing awareness to more marginalized people, biracial, people of color, indigenous, everyone that is physically appearing the antithesis of what Gabby Petito was. And their ability to take every missing person in their perspective is Gabby is profound and beautiful, and people don't see it for the pure beauty that their intention is. So I've spoken with Joe on a Twitter space once, about a year or so ago, and his commitment to enhancing the public's awareness and getting as much attention, if possible, that Gabby had gotten to any other marginalized person, he would do that all day and night. The foundation would do that all day and night. And that is what is needed too. Like society has to stop thinking that, and this is going to come out really polarizing, but society's got to stop thinking that only white, blue-haired, blonde people matter, because all people matter.
Well, there was this moment, and I think there's a natural human tendency to like people who look like me.
Yeah.
I worry more about, but like even in a recent episode with Kristen Middleman,
Middleton, yeah.
who's who's the co-founder of
Bathroom.
Othram, which is the DNA and forensic genealogy company. And she said something that took me aback, because part of the reason why I wanted to have her on, I had seen her in another interview where she answered one question about why they do what they do. And she said to me, both I think in the episode and then privately before, we're not doing our job as Othram until there is equity for everyone. And I thought that was such a powerful thing. I wanted to ask you, you said this would be controversial. This will be controversial. I wanted to ask you, so I made a donation to the wife and children of Rex Heuermann, because I view them as victims as well. And, afterwards there was an uproar made in the New York Daily News, New York Post. I got a lot of crap about it. Not that I care, because, I don't care. I do what I do. And, it did cause my behavior to change, because I think what some people don't know is I also afterwards made donations to some of the victims' families, but I did it anonymously, because I was like, I can read the New York Post headline where they're going to say I was making these donations because I got crap about that. Right. So, hey, New York Post, guess what? Did that too. And I wanted to ask you, like, do you also consider, whether it's Heuermann's family or others like that, I think of Carrie Rawson, who's Dennis Rader, the BTK killer's daughter. Do you consider them victims as well?
So before Rex was arrested last July, around last February, I began to have a friendship with Carrie. And I have profound respect for Carrie. Like, I admire her so much. She's helped enhance my awareness. She's helped enhance my humanity.
Do you know the first person I messaged about Victoria Heuermann?
That's the first person I thought of too.
Yeah. I sent a message to
So
Carrie and I said,
yeah,
I don't know what to do to help, but hey.
Because I admin a Facebook group, and I have my own Twitter, which wasn't as big then as it is now. And I was a mod in another group, and I had relatively respectful standing in other groups. I felt it was important that as a community, we don't attack Rex's family. I felt it was important to state clearly that Asa, Victoria, and Christopher were victims. Certainly not victims that lost their lives, but victims nonetheless. And I made sure that in those groups, that standard was respected. I allowed people to voice a dissenting opinion, but I would never allow it to get out of control. I would give warnings, and a few times I've had to remove people. I wanted to extend that empathy. I wanted to be, for me, a more equitable human being, a more equitable advocate, and give them that respect.
I had a coworker that I worked with a couple years ago, and this eventually caused her to leave her job. The anxiety was enormous, but she had found that her brother-in-law had been arrested by the FBI for child sexual abuse materials. I've met plenty of people who have found themselves in similar situations, and certainly I've probably spoken to hundreds of family members in the hours after they found out that their son, brother, whoever was just arrested for murder. And, like I had a job to do, but man, it was so hard to sit in that mom's living room. I remember one in Brooklyn in particular where I had her son's rap sheet in my back pocket. And she was telling me about him. And I didn't realize that the police had not told her yet that he was arrested. And man, we were all crying by the end of that one. But I think sometimes we can just be so selective in our empathy and have such a difficult time putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
I absolutely agree with you on that. And I think to drill down a little bit deeper, equitable in our empathy, but I also think that people are selective in their anger. And I think that is a bit of a problem in this case, because
What do you mean by that?
you see these factions now where there's hair evidence on almost all of the victims from, family members, ex-partners, and the conspiracy theorists go bananas thinking that they're a part of it. I don't have a lot of the hair, but my hair is probably in a house that I don't live in anymore because I go and visit my kids every once in a while.
No doubt. I mean, I've been on several trips where I have found like long women's hair on my shirts, and I'm like, that's not me. So
yeah. I mean, when my daughter comes to visit and sleeps in my bed while I'm on the sofa, like I'll find her hair in my room for a year later. Like,
yes.
It's just ridiculous. And I think people want to be angry at something or someone, and
they
when
want to target.
but that's what I don't understand. You have a target. He's 6'5", 250 pounds, sitting in a Suffolk County jail. There's your target. Like, the family isn't it. Now I'll go a little bit further. I do believe that they're victims until charges are laid. I do believe that they, and I'll still say this, lacked enough awareness to really empathize with the victims and the families that lost someone. And
I also think that can be shock sometimes.
yes, and that's where Kerry and I have had,
and also sometimes having bad advisors.
Agreed. Kerry and I have had numerous conversations off the record about this, which is why when a YouTuber, Jay, The Shaming of Jay, asked if Kerry and I would be willing to go on their show and discuss this, where Kerry can represent the family of Rex, and I'm going to sort of, because I don't speak for any of the family members, but I can sort of handle this side. So we were sort of saying it, my lane, your lane, even though between each other, Kerry and I, we weren't in separate lanes. We were on the same highway, and it's just a different perspective and profound respect between the two of us for each other. And we learn from each other. We share things with each other. And that's what's missing in the general unnuanced public. That's controversial. I know. I don't hear you.
My friends joke with me that my empathy extends to people I'm shooting arrows at. And I think that there's some truth to that idea. Like, for me, you could make me as mad as humanly possible. you could be dangerous to a group of people and I may have to do something to step in, I'll still have empathy for you as a human being. And I think it makes at least my world
Yeah.
a better place. So one of the guests that I had on earlier this year, he was named Monte Frank, and he was a member of an Ojibwe tribe in Minnesota. His daughter, Nada, at 16 years old, it was in 2013, I think, she was sex trafficked. And eventually, you know, she came home, started to rebuild her life. And in 2021, her boyfriend murdered her. And, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a US government agency that's a part of the Department of Interior, it says that in Native communities there are probably about 4,500 missing persons cases, and they face this much higher rate of violence than others in the population. I use this as an example because you can see similar things in Hispanic communities, Black communities. Part of the reason why I use this as an example because I think they're even more marginalized.
Agreed.
More marginalized. People just don't care. I have said this 100 times. If I talk about missing, murdered Indigenous people, my download numbers drop. And I was telling my Patreon members today that I will ride that into the grave. You know, very few articles are written about these stories. People tend to ignore the victims. I wanted to ask you before we take questions, what do you think we can do from a media perspective, from being the average citizen, to put the pressure on or to incentivize people to cover and do something about these cases that don't involve blonde hair, blue-eyed white
Yeah,
women?
I think it's a multifaceted problem, and the solutions are even more multifaceted. From a law enforcement perspective, I think there needs to be a lot of standardization. I think there has to be, first and foremost, empathy extended to whoever's attempting to report a missing loved one.
Do you
I
mean
think
the standardization in terms of the process that you?
process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think empathy for one. I think they have to immediately accept and put out a missing persons report. If it costs you an hour of sitting in front of a computer, then so be it. Like, there you go. There's that. I think there should be a commitment from law enforcement to communicate regularly with the family. That doesn't happen a lot. I work a lot with cold case missing families, and one that I'm very close with right now, there's been no communication for 11 years. Despite every attempt on the family, they've gotten nothing. We've certainly made tremendous inroads, and I'm not going to
I, w-
share it
I
all
wonder.
now, but
I wonder whether this is an area where the federal government could step in
well,
and
they do. They offer
but,
incentives.
well, I mean, I'm thinking like conditionalize your funding on treating people the same way, right? The federal government funds all sorts of tactical gear and other things like that. The
Well,
reason why
that
reason
they
why we have
want.
similar speeding limits is because the
Yeah.
federal government says we won't give you the money if you don't make this your speeding limit.
Well, that's the same thing. In Billy's law, passed a couple of years ago, there are incentives for agencies to submit for grants for federal money to help identify unidentified. There's federal money out there to help solve cold cases. Some of these larger counties don't even have cold case squads, yet they have 100 unidentified. And trust me, I know because I have a goddamn map full of them. And it frustrates me that I get very upset when I see a new name as entry that,
That's the National Missing Persons
yeah,
Database.
when I see a new unidentified go up on there and you see their date of last contact or date the body was found as 30, 40 years ago, I want to scream like, why? Even NamUs has been around for 15 years. We ought to be faster at this process, and this accountability, this sharing of information should be so much more front and center, so much more with a sense of urgency to really do something to solve these cases. We can't just, and Afram, I absolutely cherish Afram. Like, I love them so much. I was enthralled on your episode with them. But are we all just waiting for Afram to clean up? I have almost 13,000 people on my map right
Right.
now, and I still got another 5,000 to go.
Right.
So how much can we put on one company to do? Agencies have an obligation them damn selves to solve these cases.
Well, one of the things I want to sort of turn it over to listeners' questions, and I got one in advance that I wanted to ask you. And the question was, do you believe that, 2000, was it 10 and 11, the first bodies were found?
Yep.
There was problems between the police, the FBI, the police and themselves. Do you believe that there could have been extra, and some people speculate based on what came out in the initial charging document for him, that he could have been caught much earlier. A lot of the key information was collected earlier. Do you believe that there are victims who could have been killed?
The information that was submitted regarding the avalanche was in 2010 anyway. So if we're looking at right now,
Well, let me just sort of, like, without that piece of it, just hone in on kind of what the listener was getting at. Do you think if the police investigation had worked well, that
I think he would have been
the death
arrested.
could have been avoided
I
too?
think he would have been arrested 10 years ago. Absolutely.
Okay.
It was corruption within Suffolk County between the district attorney and the police chief. I think that was the absolute brick wall that pushed out the FBI, that subverted anybody caring. Dominic Varone, the initial lead investigator on the case, was tossed out and, you know, sort of threatened without his pension or whatever. And I think it was all just to protect the corruption going on between James Burke, former police chief, and Thomas Spoda, the district attorney. And they were just hiding their own dirty laundry, but they were willing to do that at the expense of allowing a serial killer to continue to be a predator on the island.
So here's a second question that flows really nicely, and it was, do you think that there were any victims that were killed after the initial bodies were found? And do you think, if they, because none have been officially announced, if the person is a victim, do you think that death could have been avoided?
I think the death could have been avoided. Yes, I think there was the murder of Natasha Jugo, and in my opinion, it's a murder of Natasha Jugo in 2013, and that could easily have been avoided had law enforcement had the free reign to continue, and I'm not gonna put it all on Burke
She
and
was the
Spoda.
one who was found on West Gilgo Beach. You had
Yes,
told me about her. She disappeared and then was found in the same
pretty much
place
the same
months
spot
later
3 months
with
later.
no decomp.
Very little decomp,
Yeah,
and a rope wrapped around her. A
yeah.
rope is evident in the one redacted photo of her.
So you really do think that there's a possibility
Yes.
there.
Well,
So
we know that once the task force had eyes on Rex, that he was still patronizing sex workers. Like,
mm,
that's a fact that came out of their own mouths. Uh, for whatever reason, they didn't interact with him at that moment. Um, I question the safety of those sex workers at that time, but I do trust the task force to that extent. I don't think Rex has killed anybody since 2020. I think when Geraldine Hart, the police commissioner at that time of Suffolk County, put out the picture of the
the
WHHW
belt.
belt, I think that literally scared Rex enough.
And that was the belt that they had found on Maureen,
Maureen. Yeah.
and that also, they match or had initials on it.
It has initials on it, but it also had hairs on them.
Right.
So I think he got nervous at 2020 with the release of that information. Also, remember Valerie Mack was just identified right before that.
And didn't they find Google searches around that time on his
They
part?
did. Yeah.
Yeah, related to the investigation.
Yeah. So I think he was worried that something was coming, but you go to his perspective another 3 years with nothing whatsoever other than political hyperbole in his perception. It was also in my perception that nothing was going to happen. Um, but they were watching him. They had him. They found the evidence. This state trooper, whoever she is just a, an amazing individual, in my opinion. And they had it. They found him. They got him.
And the
So
state trooper's the one who figured out the clue about the avalanche,
the avalanche, the physical descriptions. Yep,
pulled it together.
she's the one.
Wow. So one of the things sort of Aaron asks, which I think is a great question, how do you think we can become more comfortable with our similarities with victims without becoming too fearful? So I think that's the idea that we were talking about before, that we're kind of afraid to imagine ourselves as a victim.
Yeah, it's also generational, um, unconscious biases, right? Because we're brought up under certain strictures and perceptions and opinions of other people that are given to us by our parents and our environment and our society relative to who we are, where we live. And in at the start of the show, I don't know if it was live yet, where I talked about how I went from selling high-end jewelry to selling sneakers. I think I began to broaden my awareness of how great people are generally. So I think to become comfortable identifying similarities with victims is to not look at them as a victim. Look at Jessica Taylor as somebody you might have known, commented on her eyes or her smile or her hairdo or her laugh, or imagine what her laugh might have been. Imagine someone who is a victim that looks like somebody you knew, or just imagine that victim is someone you knew, someone you were related to, someone you loved. And when you can start to put a victim in place of a family member of your own, a loved one of your own, then they're not a sex worker. They're not struggling with addiction. They're a young woman. They're a mom. They're a person. And I think that's how we got to start looking at. That's how it worked for me. I started looking at them as human beings, as people that loved them and that they had love for others. And then everything else becomes irrelevant.
It's so interesting you say that, because when I do, for example, the missing and murdered Indigenous people case, I imagine one of my friends who's Indigenous and it happening to her, and her family losing her and her kids being taken. When I do stories on children, or stories, I think I'm still a reporter, but when I talk about them, I remember this little girl who was in Manhattan and a brick randomly fell and killed her. I have people that I connect them to my life to drive that same empathy and that same sense of loss. Let me give you a chance to do you this has been a great conversation. Wanted to give you a chance to see if you had any closing thoughts. I really think, and I know you don't feel like you're an expert in the families. I feel like you've really given us a glimpse into what life is like, and their humanity, and um, all sorts of other things. And I know you don't speak for them, But in a way, you, like we all should, you give voice to them and to the victims. Are there any closing thoughts that you have, whether it's on that or anything else that stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all night, but I think I say all the time I don't speak for the victims and I can't relate to what they experience because I haven't suffered loss, profound loss the way they did. Um, but it doesn't mean I'm not aware of it, and it doesn't mean I don't know what they go through. Um, and that's for them to tell that part of that story. It's not for me. I wouldn't I wouldn't share it even if they told me I could. It's too personal, and I don't feel, no matter how much I stand for them or advocate for their loved one, that it's just not my place to share. And I think for me, having that insight or having that knowledge or that understanding, um, try not to get emotional on this. This is the this is the beauty of a relationship with someone like that. This is the trust and the respect and the honor, and it would be the
They've
same as if I
they've
shared my best friend's secrets, you
well,
know?
they've entrusted you to help tell their stories, which is unbelievably powerful, and I feel and can relate to that. But they've also done another thing, which is they've entrusted you to the parts of their stories they don't want told. And to to get there and to have that moment requires such a level of deep connection and trust, especially for people who haven't always been treated well by the world.
It's true, and that's what's sad, and that's why I will stand fiercely for any of them, regardless if I have a relationship with them or not. I started standing for their loved one before I had relationships. It's what helped bridge the gap, with me with them. And then it wasn't never my intention or goal. I never set out to cozy up to a family member. That's a burden. And I don't mean that in a negative way. And I've said this with several of them. It carries a responsibility to have a relationship with someone who's gone through such traumatic loss, and then getting ruined by the system for 10, 20 years. So it's a heavy burden for them. It's a heavy burden to often be a friend. Sometimes being a friend, it means that you're getting screamed at in the middle of the afternoon,
Yeah,
and
'cause that's who they have.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's fine. I may not be the biggest person, but my shoulders are as broad as the planet because I'll give it to them all the time. And
So, I have one last question for
yeah,
you.
ask away.
How do you get the strength? Like, you said to me that you're that person who empathizes with everyone and everything, and I think a lot of us with empathy fear we're not going to have the strength to get through things like this that are so emotional and so hard, much less being yelled at by
Yeah,
someone we care about. Where do you get that from?
I think strength and empathy are two separate things. I have recently been challenged an awful lot, and I didn't know if I had the strength for it. But empathy is self-fulfilling. It's regenerative. It'll always be
Maybe
there.
it's where the strength comes from.
I believe that is it. I think it is who I am in my core. I'm an empathetic person. People call me a simp or people call me all these names. I don't care. At the end of the day, I value my commitment to victims, my commitment to the families, and that's just in the list case. There's people behind me, Dawn and Dawn. There's almost 13,000 people on the map. I just empathy is bottomless. It's endless. It is all fulfilling. It is all around. It is like oxygen. It's always there. All you have to do is tap into it and make it work for you. And that's what I try to do.
That makes sense. All right, Raul, I wanted to thank you and go ahead and close out. Much appreciated. I'm really grateful that you came on.
I'm honored to be asked to be on. I appreciate it. I'm always humbled by it. You know, it isn't easy to sometimes to talk about the things we talk about, to be vulnerable in front of countless numbers of people and for posterity, because people years from now may see all of this, and um it's still just from my soul is the right thing to do, and I really only do it with the right people. I turn down requests all the time and I say yes rarely. So the people that I do engage with, the people that I advocate for, the people that I'll moderate for or engage with, they just mean a little bit more to me. And you're certainly one of them, sir. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us as well, by the way. I've already taken enough of Raul's time. I did not think this would be one of those ones where I was planning on doing one episode and I got 2 episodes, but this feels like one of those 2 episodes or episode and bonus episode kind of thing. But I think it's just such a like truly important topic. I was literally talking about this today. I don't know if you've heard yet the little Patreon bonus that I dropped. But I don't care if everyone hates me and hates my podcast. I am going to do these stories and these stories and these stories until we have one listener, which might be me.
I'll always listen.
Yeah. So two. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. We
Thank
will
you.
see you soon. Hang on for a sec, Raul. Don't
Yep.
disappear too fast.